All right, for today, we're only covering a very small section of the Bible. It's very simple. It's not convoluted or layered at all. So this should be nice, simple, and sweet. We'll probably end 20 minutes early. April Fools. That's the only April Fool's joke I can squeeze in for today because, today is a doozy. So the first two lessons of this class covered 3 pages of Zach's Bible that I stole. These 3 right here. That's all it covered for our first 2 lessons. And then last week and this week cover 1,200 pages of Zach's Bible. So there is a whole lot that we are covering from multiple different genres, multiple different histories, talking about prophetic literature that has interpretations in the present, in the future. So it is really, really dense. So I tried to find a graphic that is tried to simplify as much of it as is possible. I'm not going to be overtly referencing this piece of paper throughout my talk, but you can track along with what I'm saying with this. There's a united Israel at the beginning, then it splits, and then there's different prophets in each of the different kingdoms. It's kind of color coordinated, timeline coordinated, so it kind of gives you a visual image of the passage of time as we go through this. This graphic right here, as well as many of the other items that we've handed you in this class, come from the Visual Theology Guide to the Bible, just a good book that has a lot of great visuals to help you understand the Bible and theology. So if you are a visual learner and like that sort of thing, like this gentleman right over here, consider picking up this book right here to help you on your journey. I'm going to pray for myself one more time because I need any help that I can get from God to take all of this and condense it and make it clear. So let's pray. God, as we dive into your word and try and take a lot of history, a lot of what you were doing throughout history, help me to be concise and clear, and send your Spirit to work in and through me and in and through the people in this room, that they would have a supernatural understanding of what you've been doing throughout history, that they would know you better and that it would transform their lives. In your name we pray. Amen. So as we dive into this, my primary goal is to try and give you a historical through line of a big chunk of the Old Testament, to know the big historical events that go along with it, and then thematically what God was doing and telling his people through the prophets. So historical events also lining up with the prophetic messages that were coming at that time, while also tracking the promises that were made to Abraham and what they looked like in each phase of the Old Testament. We are looking at about 600 years of history, 600 years of prophets. It is a whole lot of stuff. But as always with this particular class, we're starting with a little bit of a recap because we always have to keep reminding you of where we started, what matters most. We're going to fly through some of this. So kicking things off, once again, we're in the garden. Things are good. We have intimacy with God. But we get to Genesis 3. Stuff happens, sin enters the picture, rebellion enters the picture, and all of a sudden that intimacy is broken. Sin separates us from God, but God makes that first promise that there is a skull crush coming that will defeat sin and ultimately redeem us. Jump forward after sin has spread, a bunch of other things have happened, get to Genesis 12, and kind of the main plot of the Bible really starts to kick into action, where God calls Abram, later named Abraham, and makes 4 promises. These are 4 promises. They're super duper important. That's why we keep coming back to it, because it's thematically so important for everything that happens. We're going to have a lot of ups and downs in today's passage, and everything that happens go back to, how does this tie back to them being in the land? Sometimes they're not in the land. How does this tie back to them being a great people, a great nation, and that blessing? So this happens to Abraham, then we go through the book of Genesis, several hundred years pass, we go to the Exodus and Moses, where God reintroduces himself to his people, shows that he is better and more powerful than the gods of Egypt, delivers them into the wilderness, where then Moses is given the law. And the law both gives us the way that we are supposed to live, as well as giving them a governmental structure, as well as certain things were designed to make them separate from the other nations. Another key idea that they're going to violate in parts of today where they start intermingling, but gives them the law. Eventually they go into the land. You get the Joshua and the conquest of the land. Then you get the book of Judges where everyone did what was right in their own eyes. They said that they wanted a king, but for the wrong reasons. And last week we kind of had this kind of peak of the nation of Israel where they were a united kingdom, where for one batch of time the tribes came together, they had kings, and Israel turned into that great nation. Not under Saul, he did not have a heart for God. But then David did have a heart for God. He was still a sinner, but he was passionate and he loved God and was doing his best to do all these things for God. And so the nation starts to become great. They're now in the land, they're a great people, and they're a great nation, and God reaffirms to David, there's a blessing coming through your bloodline. So all four of them are looking really, really good. But his son Solomon, while he was the wisest man of all time, his heart wasn't fully committed to God. And so he started to marry other nations, and it led to utter chaos. So much so that after his death, his son takes control. Rehoboam wasn't a wise man, wasn't particularly bright, and just tears the nation apart, and it splits in two. So the united nation of Israel only had 3 kings. Like every time I hear that, even though that's something I have known for decades now, every time I hear that, you think of the nation of Israel, it only had 3 kings where they were united. And then they split and turned to 2 different nations. The northern kingdom was Israel, and the southern nation was Judah. So some raw statistics and data, kind of what that looked like. But the nation divides. And this is the part where you get this enormous chunk of the Old Testament, and where you start getting all of these prophets showing up. And it's very cyclical. A lot of the same stuff happens over and over again. The big idea, the Old Testament is the story of the Israelites' continued failures. They keep turning from God, and God's continued faithfulness. They keep turning away despite everything that God's done for them, despite all the times that they face persecution, everything that happens, they keep turning away, and God keeps raising up these deliverers, these prophets to try and set them right, and it only lasts for a small period of time. So, big part of what we're talking about today are the prophets. And actually, some raw data on here. I said this before, it was on the screen, but the Northern Kingdom reigned for 209 years, had 19 kings, but they were all bad. None of them had a heart for God. None of them. It was just utter chaos for 209 years. Southern Kingdom did better, lasted 345 years. They had 19 kings, and about 8 of them actually served God. So there was some good in there, but they were even batting under 50% when it came to when they were serving God and when they weren't. Just kept turning from God. And this is where you have all of these prophets. So, trying to think of a way to if you're trying to have some illustration of what is the story of the Old Testament, it's basically the story of God trying to parent the nation of Israel. So you think if you got kids, or if at some point in time in your life you were a kid, I suspect that's all of you, you know all of the ways in which kids keep repeating the same things. You have the same conversations. So my son has always hated school, never enjoyed school, likes to stay home. He'll learn all sorts of stuff on his own, but having to go to school for 8 hours a day, he thinks that that's a really bad deal. And so many times we have to sit down with him, explain, I get it, school's no fun, but we want you to be a productive member of society when you grow up, because you can't live in our basement when you grow up, because we live in Texas and there are no basements. So you're going to turn 18, we're going to kick you out. And so when that happens, we want you to be prepared, and that means taking steps right now that are unpleasant. He doesn't like it, but we have to keep having that conversation with him. And sometimes he doesn't do his homework, and there's consequences. Or they fight over this iPad. Luckily, I was able to bring it tonight so I can actually teach. I won the fight over the iPad, but they're always fighting over who gets the iPad. And they'll start getting mean and nasty and do all sorts of crazy stuff. And so then nobody gets the iPad. We take the iPad away and we have to hide it in the house so they don't try and track it down or whatever. And they're like, what? He was the one that took it. He did this one. If you guys can't behave, if you can't share the iPad, if you can't decide what you're going to listen to go to sleep, nobody gets the iPad. And there's all these ways in which we take away a blessing from them, or there's a punishment, a consequence, or they get in trouble. It's not because we're mad at them. It's because we want the best for them. We want to prepare them for life. And sometimes that has consequences, and the bigger the rebellion, the bigger the things they do, maybe the bigger the consequence that might be really painful for them. But it's so that they learn for the future, and they grow, and they mature. There's all these little ways. That's what parenting is all about. And you get to the Old Testament, and Israel keeps rebelling. They keep not learning the lesson. And so then a new prophet needs to come in and parent them once again and try and lead them back. And then they do it again. You have the same conversation over and over again. Same way. I keep having the iPad conversation with my kids. Keep having the school conversation with my son. Over and over. And that's what so much of the Old Testament is. Israel not learning. God pursues his people. God rebels. God sends a prophet to get them to return. Maybe they do better for a little bit, or maybe they ignore the prophet entirely, which frequently happens in particular with Israel. But that's so much of what the Old Testament is. So what is a prophet? Prophet was a person who spoke on behalf of God to the people. When they spoke with the authority of God as his appointed messenger. So this is God has a message for his people. He has someone with authority that has been sent to speak for him. And so much of it, there's kind of two themes that keep popping up all throughout the prophetic literature: judgment, but also hope. You keep coming back to these two big, gigantic themes that they're in trouble. Bad stuff's coming. If you don't turn back, Babylon's coming. The Assyrians are coming. Bad things will happen if you don't turn back. But also reminders that God will be faithful. And God has a plan for Israel. Also gets tricky because when it comes to prophetic literature, it's multiple different genres and it's intended for multiple different audiences at different times. So when you read it, it gets confusing at times. So sometimes it's personal, like a prophet's own struggling and wrestling with God. Other times it's those warnings, it's the judgment, predictions of immediate future events that could happen. Sometimes it gets real specific, like if you guys don't turn around now, that nation right over there, they're coming in. Please stop. Please stop. Spoiler alert, they don't stop. Other times it's apocalyptic. This is the one that's kind of the most famous because it's the flashiest. That's the predictions of the end of the world. Eschatology, to give you a fancy church word, theology word. So some of it's apocalyptic. And then others are those messages of hope, promises for God's people. So many of them about Jesus. And in the midst of dire warnings of impeding doom, there will also be these little glimpses of hope for God's plan for his people. Despite their rebellion, he's still there. There's judgment, and then there's hope. Unfortunately, God's people keep ignoring everything that he has to say. So I'm going to try and walk through each of the two kingdoms. So like I said, they have 3 kings in the United Kingdom, and then it gets real tricky when you look at the Old Testament because it splits into Judah and Israel and covers hundreds of years. There's multiple different history books that run parallel to each other, sometimes overlap with the stories that they're telling. Then you also have the poetic literature at this exact same time period, and then you have the prophets also at the same time period. So that's where hopefully you can look at the piece of paper in front of you and it'll kind of give you a way to see kind of the passage of time and where each of kind of the prophets fall in everything kind of going on. With the nation of Israel, the northern kingdom, it lasted from about 931 BC to 722 BC. They never served God. They had 0 good kings. They were always in constant rebellion. One of the earlier prophets coming out of the northern kingdom was actually Jonah. And one of the things about this story that I think is so crucial that sometimes we miss from this story is that it communicates that God always had a heart for the world, always had a heart for the nations. One of the things I always found funny about a lot of the stories that we teach children and that we do the flannel graph with, so many of the most popular kids for stories are so not kids stories whatsoever. Noah and the ark, it has a lot of cute animals. And it's like the besides the darkest moment in human history. It's about everyone dying. Not super cute. When you have the picture of like the smiling lion on the no, wrong tone. Joshua and the walls of Jericho. There's even a song, Joshua at the battle of Jericho, and the walls came tumbling down, and then everyone was killed. Like it doesn't leave out that last line in there, but it's pretty dark stuff. Samson, sleazy guy. He's like a superhero, but also super duper not a superhero. And then you get Jonah. It's kind of this fantastical side that makes it pop, but it's a story about a prophet that did not understand God's heart. That he did not, he actively rebelled. He's so far from a role model in any way. But Jonah 1 says, the word of the Lord came to Jonah, son of Amittai, go to the great city of Nineveh and preach against it because its wickedness has come up before me. So right there in the Old Testament, God sent a prophet to go. What do we call our mission trips at our church? Go trips. Because God's heart has always been to go. We're all created in the image of God. We're commanded to be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth, and God has a heart for all of his people. Now, Israel is his chosen people with a distinct, specific role and purpose in God's mission and plan throughout the Old Testament. Yes, absolutely, but we're all made in the image of God, and God had a heart for his people. But Jonah didn't get it. But Jonah ran away from the Lord and headed for Tarshish. He didn't get it. He ran away from God's heart and what God was trying to do. And just so easy to miss what God is doing and what God is passionate about. But just want to stop at this story just because even though it doesn't fit into the main discussion, what we're talking about today, it also communicates God's heart in the Old Testament. Other gigantic, huge prophets, if you did your homework, read the chapter, talk about Elijah and Elisha. And some of the earliest prophets after Moses in the northern kingdom, they were sent to try and call the nation back, where you had under King Ahab, horrible apostasy taking place. Worship of Baal was just running rampant. And so they're sent in to try and get the people to turn back. Prophets are literally being killed in all of this. And so Elijah challenges the prophets of Baal to a competition. And spoiler alert, once again, Team God wins. Baal loses on this one. But it says in 1 Kings 19, and kind of this discussion between Elijah and God. He said, I have been zealous for the Lord God Almighty. The Israelites have rejected your covenant, torn down your altars, put your prophets to death with the sword. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me too. So sometimes you're like, why did God allow his people to suffer? They were in utter rebellion against him so often and in extreme ways. So God responds back in verse 18, "Yet I reserve 7,000 in Israel, all whose knees have not bowed down to Baal." And it's where there's little glimpses of hope to where even in times of utter rebellion where prophets are being killed, God's like, no, there's a remnant. As much as it seems bleak, there's still people that believe. And as far as they go, there's always that remnant. There's always that line that's part of what God's plan and what he's doing. But just as like this simple, quick snapshot of the nation of Israel, this is our quick glimpse. Constant rebellion to the point of killing prophets. So in 722, the Assyrians come in and essentially take Israel captive, and it is no more. Wiped out. It lasted 209 years, and it's wiped out. And as a little piece of kind of history to kind of fill in those Bible gaps, in the New Testament, they talk about the Samaritans, the Good Samaritan, the area of Samaria that they tried to avoid, where they just had extreme prejudice against the people in Samaria. The Samaritans in Samaria come from the Assyrian captivity, and that event taking place to where the people that kind of remained in Israel, they started to marry the Assyrians. And so instead of remaining a nation set apart and different, they started to marry with the Assyrians and share some of their beliefs. And so they were kind of Jewish, but also kind of Assyrian. And that's where kind of Samaria and the Samaritans came from. So when you get to the New Testament, why do the Jews have a negative view of them? There's this 800, 700 year history going back from where that's coming from. And some of it traces back to Israel's constant rebellion. And then even after they were taken captive, they still were disobeying, leading to what happened there. That'll bring us to Judah, the southern kingdom. And so after the Assyrians kind of come in, take over Israel, you have Judah alone, and they did better. As we mentioned before, 8 of their 19 kings were actually good. They had some good revivals. They had times where they did serve God, but they also still had that natural tendency to drift away and drift towards sin and rebellion. And so in here we get several kind of crucial prophets. Jeremiah was one of them, a prophet who came in and started warning them, guys, it's looking bad. If you don't turn back, God is going to send the Babylonians from over there. What happened to the other kingdom with the Assyrians, that's about to happen to us from the Babylonians. And they didn't listen. And then Ezekiel comes along, same kind of around the same time period, same sort of idea, where he's warning them. It's going to be destroyed. Everything is going to be destroyed if you don't turn back. And it's a point in time where things are starting to get so bad that even some of the Israelites are performing human sacrifices to the Canaanite gods. Once again, why on earth would God allow his nation to be taken captive by the Babylonians? Because they were drifting so far off to such a dark place that they needed to be corrected in the most extreme ways, but it needed to happen. But also in the midst of everything kind of going on here, there's still those passages in the prophets that are hopeful. So Isaiah 10 says, "In that day, the remnant of Israel, the survivors of Jacob, will no longer rely on him struck down, but will truly rely on the Lord, the Holy One of Israel. A remnant will return. A remnant of Jacob will return to the mighty God." In the midst of like this doom and gloom, it's always clear. There's a remnant. There's some who will keep believing. Then Jeremiah 31:31 says, "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel, with the people of Judah." God keeps saying, it's bad, Babylonians are coming, but there will be a day when God makes a new covenant. As bad as it looks, as bad as it's about to get, God still has a plan and he will be faithful. But they didn't listen. They kept not listening. So this leads to the Babylonian captivity in 586, where even the southern kingdom is taken over by the Babylonians. There are 19 kings, over 300 years. They too are taken over by the Babylonians. And if you kind of go back to our promises, I think I have a slide for this. We reach a point in time, they've lost the land. There's still people. Nation is gone. They were one united nation, then they were two nations, now they are zero nations. God's made his promise, but how is this promise going to be fulfilled? They're not even in the land anymore. But to kind of tie into some other stories we talk about a lot with in children's classes, this is where you get Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. This is where you get Daniel in the lion's den, where the nation is crumbled. They're taken out of the land. If ever there was a time for Daniel to doubt God, if ever there was a time for Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego to be like, I guess God isn't being faithful, it was then, where they're taken out of the land. That's why their actions weren't just actions of boldness that you'd be willing to be thrown into a lion's den or a furnace, but while you were out of the land and it looked like all was lost, they were still faithful. They still believed God's promises and that God would prevail, that God would persevere. And so that's so much of what those stories that you hear them as a kid, they're powerful, but they're even more powerful when you understand the full context of what that story stands for in the history of the Bible. So after 70 years out of the land, they're allowed to return. So they send a group of people back to rebuild the temple. And then in Nehemiah, they come back and he builds the walls. And around this time, there's 58,000 Israelites back in the land. And they've got something there. But you think, this is where the Old Testament ends at. Less than 100,000 people in the land with some sort of temple. They're back in the land. They are there. But they're not a great people anymore. Certainly not like they were. They're not really a nation like they were before. And God's made these promises, but it feels so distant. It feels like, how could anything ever come from this? We had this promise from this serpent crusher. We had this promise to Abraham. Then it was repeated to David. And this is all we have now. In storytelling, you have these moments in movies, in books, where it feels like all is lost. So you think you're watching a rom-com, you've started to really enjoy the two people, they've started to like each other, and then normally there's some misunderstanding or there is some deception in the plot that gets revealed about 75% of the way through the movie, and they break up. They're not going to get back together. All is done. Or you're in fantasy. We formed a fellowship to try and destroy a ring, and we're in some caves. Gandalf gets pulled into a big, gigantic hole, and then your fellowship breaks up. How are we going to get the ring destroyed? Or maybe you're in Marvel, and you're in the middle of some sort of Infinity Saga where Thanos has managed to get all of the Infinity Stones, and he's wiped out half of all life in the universe. Feels like all is lost. There's no hope to undo this. Or maybe we're in the world of Star Wars, and you're at the Battle of Endor, and unfortunately Han Solo and his crew down on the planet, they've failed. They've been taken captive. That means the shields are still up, so the fighters in space can't attack the Death Star 2 to get in to blow it up. And Luke, he's actually being tempted by the Emperor and Darth Vader. So in stories, you have these moments where it feels like all is lost. There is no hope. And you can get to the end of the Old Testament and feel a lot of that. Like, what happened? I guess God failed. But we skipped over the most important promises. See, all throughout the prophets, there are also these promises of a coming Messiah. That when you read them in the context of the New Testament, sometimes they're almost a little bit eerie as to how, like, you read them and you go, this feels like this could be in the New Testament, because it was a prophecy about Jesus. So Isaiah 9 says, "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. The government will be on his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the greatness of his government and the peace there will be no end. He will reign on David's throne over his kingdom, upholding it with justice and righteousness from that time on and forever. The zeal of the Lord will accomplish this." These promises that there is a Messiah coming. He will be a wonderful counselor. And then Isaiah 53, the suffering servant. Verse 3, "He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering, familiar with pain, like one from whom people hid their faces. He was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned away, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Jumping ahead to verse 10. "Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him, to cause him to suffer. And through the Lord makes his life an offering for sin. He will see his offspring and prolong his days, and he will be the will of the Lord to prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied by the knowledge of my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities." See, it seemed like all hope was lost, but all along the way, God kept reminding them, "I will be faithful. You might not be faithful. You might not be doing your part in this, but I will be faithful." And there is a prophet coming who is the greatest of all prophets. There is a sacrifice coming that will be the perfect offering that will fulfill the entire law. That we won't need this sacrificial system anymore because he will complete the whole thing. All along the way, he was promising. He was giving hope. If you just read it, it's all right in there. God was telling them his plan all along the way, giving them hope. And for us, we know the whole story of what's happening, that Jesus was coming to fulfill the law. And where Israel couldn't, and where I can't, and where you can't, he can. And he bore all of our sins so that we could be forgiven and be made right with God.